This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
It's a real privilege to be present at the birth of Chase, a center which charts a wonderfully fertile field of history, and one with so much intellectual promise and excitement. Regrettably, I cannot claim much excitement for my topic this afternoon, for I simply wanted to share with you a few reflections concerning the various ordeals which any Qur'an translator must undergo. It is entirely a personal testament, and one which recycles shamelessly some earlier views found in the introduction to my translation of the Quran, plus one or two earlier lectures on the subject, for which my profound apologies. If I run over 30 minutes, Alistair, please hum or ho or clear your throat or make some other noise. It's now a cliche to say that translation is a lonely job, and to this cliche I might respond that any sustained piece of writing is a lonely job. Writing a novel, for example, is not exactly a gregarious activity. On the other hand, one could argue that the dictionaries and the commentaries and previous translations one needs for translating the Quran act with their many voices like companions who keep the translator anything but lonely. In fact, very busy indeed as he or she navigates among them. Begin with translating the Quran imposes one or two or perhaps three distinct burdens on the translator. The first is the decision that has to be made at every single phrase as to the best rendering. We'll come to what best might mean later on, but the pressure is unrelenting, and in the case of the Quran is daunting. Ludwig Wittgenstein, you will remember, has this very curious epigram: if a lion could speak, we would not understand him. A philosopher once explained to me what that strange epigram meant. If a lion could speak, he would speak Lionese. And now that God has spoken, can we really understand him? Can we really understand Godese? Nor is understanding Godese made any simpler by the fact that we do not, it seems to me, make enough allowance for the Quran's often deliberate mystification. The self-referential epithet mutashabah enshrines the mystification, in addition to frequent Quranic references such as "how can you know what X or Y or Z means?" In other words, to its intentional ambiguity. This is a text which, while claiming manifest clarity, is partially meant at least to make the flesh creep, somewhat like the shudder in T.S. Eliot. Or else we might call it the mysterium tremens, that which causes you to tremble and to be awed by the divinely unfathomable. The mystery is there quite by design and meant to be just that, a mystery which causes a shudder. And that shudder is so culture and language specific that it often defies translation. The second burden is that translation in general, and translating the Quran in particular, is what one might call a Sisyphean activity, that no matter how close to the top you push and shove your rock of language, it will always come tumbling down before you reach that top. No matter how well you fancy you have captured the meaning, there's always a sense of regret as you surrender the manuscript to the publisher. It is as if, having said goodbye to a beloved, you will always regret that your goodbye was not more eloquently expressed. The French call it l'esprit de l'escalier. This sort of feeling does not happen, or at least nowhere near to the same extent, with other pieces of writing or other translations. Or the dominant feeling when one is through with them, or at least when I am through with them, is generally one of relief or even good riddance and good luck. Translating the Quran, however, is a perpetually haunting experience, and one which can never leave the translator with a sense of fulfillment. The third burden is philological. In recent years, much work has been done on the vocabulary of the Quran and how many terms in the Quran can be better understood if we examine their origins in Syriac or Ethiopic or Greek or whatever. There's a great deal of this going on and seems to be increasing as an industry. All the way from a learned biochemist relative of mine who argued that Tayran Ababil in Quran 105, Surah Al-Fil, means not flocks of birds, but something more like fiery flying objects, from the Syriac, Abule, and which still survives in colloquial Lebanese, meaning a fire. I.e., it was a volcanic eruption that dispersed Ashab al-Fil. His other theory was that وَالسَّمَاءُ وَالطَّارِقُ of Surah 86. The Tariq was in fact Halley's comet, calculated as having appeared around the year 618, which is a perfect chronological match. To my friend the late Kamal Salibi's theory that Inna a'tainaka al-Kawthar, Surah Al-Kawthar 108, is best rendered, we gave you kosher, i.e. the law of halal and haram, which makes better sense in context. To the current favorite that paradise is full of grapes rather than maidens or virgins, and I'm afraid to the funniest of them all, that hitting the wife verse in Quran 4:34 refers to the husband departing from rather than hitting, or even to having sexual intercourse with the long-suffering wife. And I'm full of admiration for this kind of ingenuity, or some of it anyway. But this is really little more than philology, or else polemic, fighting a rearguard action against the march of cultural theory. Let me explain. The maidens or virgins of paradise have been with us for, let's be conservative, at least 1,000 years. They have penetrated the deepest layers of what Charles Taylor calls the social imaginary, in this case, the Muslim social imaginary. Let us consider the following scenario. A biblical scholar now discovers that the fishes in Jesus' miracle of the feeding of the 5,000 do not refer to fishes at all, but to something more like popcorn. Or that Joshua's trumpet at Jericho was not really a trumpet at all, but a mangonel. Very interesting, but then what? And in my immediate case of translating the Quran, do I examine these philological suggestions and choose the latest or the most convincing, quote unquote, alternatives? Or do I purvey to a Western reader what Muslims down the ages and in their majority took these words to mean? There is simply no hesitation between the two alternatives. Finally, there's the widespread view that Arabic is in some peculiar sense extremely difficult to translate, and the reason most often given is that Arabic words often have contradictory meanings. This is sometimes part of a larger attempt to exoticize Arabic or even Islamic civilization, to argue that somehow as a language it is unique in its ambiguity and difficulty, but I'm sorry to say Arabic shares with all other languages known to me this characteristic of possessing words with multiple meanings. Yes, it does have a difficult syntax and morphology, but no more so than, say, ancient Greek. So the choices that a translator has are by no means unlimited, and even the difficult Arabic of the Quran is not insuperable, given the huge battery of commentaries that have accompanied the text down the ages. So let me now turn to these companions I had while translating. First among my companions, my Muslim companions, was Tabari, whom I adopted early on as my anchor, my guru. I don't need to defend my choice of Tabari before this audience, but perhaps the most remarkable thing about him is that while having many ideological axes to grind, He was anti-Qadarite, anti-Shiite, anti-Hanbalite. He nevertheless reproduced with astonishing fidelity a very wide spectrum of ancient views, including those he did not subscribe to himself. Unlike many contemporary Muslim conservative thinkers, Tabari, or any other pre-modern thinker for that matter, would never ever presume to say that the position of Islam on this or that Quranic doctrine or phrase is such and such. He would never use that phrase. Although he will say instead, I prefer this or that interpretation, but he always positioned himself inside a wide circle of interpretation, leaving the status of the problem open. In addition to Tabari, I became very attached to Suyuti's Al-Itqan fi Ulum al-Quran, a wonderfully succinct and very well organized treasury of opinions and interpretations. My third guru was Ibn Qutayba's Ta'wil Mushkil al-Quran, a masterpiece of literary erudition. Many other classical commentaries and studies were used, especially the very convenient Al-Jalalain, but the above three were in my intimates, my constant guides. My other group of companions were previous translations, but let me say at the very outset that any criticism I have of my predecessors, especially if they're included in this audience, must not in any sense be interpreted to mean, God forbid, that I have done better. It is simply quite impossible for any Qur'an translator to ignore those who came before. One is always working under their shadow. At this conference, it's quite unnecessary for me to speak at any length at all on English translations of the 18th and 19th centuries. Of the three translations I consulted, Sale, Rodwell, and Palmer, Sale's translation remains to this day an astonishing achievement, setting standards for accuracy that neither Rodwell nor Palmer were later on to equal. Norman Daniel states that readers of Sale's translation have complained not so much of its lack of accuracy, but of it, I quote, not being sufficiently lively in expression or elevated in style. Slightly harsh, I think. In any case, Sale was a constant companion, while Rodwell and Palmer were soon abandoned as guides. The Rodwell translation is often very free and speculative, too intent upon biblicizing diction, and generally less graceful than Sale. The Palmer translation 20 years later displays a more strict adherence to the literal meaning than Rodwell, and therefore is often less understandable and even less readable than his two predecessors, in addition to its numerous mistakes. When we move to the 20th century, one of the more significant developments in the 20th century was the appearance of translations done by British Indian Muslims, often in conjunction with a modernizing agenda. The Rodwell-Palmer translations had cast a long shadow over the field. Thus, Rodwell, for instance, had made no secret of his view that he was dealing with a Muhammad-made text, while at times he described as lofty, was nevertheless intermixed with, I quote, morbid hallucinations, fantastic legends, self-deception, and similar mid-Victorian psychological notions. To counter such opinions, the new translations by Muslims had about them a sense of mission, an urge to present the Qur'an to English readers in all its pristine grandeur, and as experienced by qualified Muslims, I'm quoting, in their own mental and spiritual vision, as Yusuf Ali phrased it. Pickthall, a British convert, goes even further, asserting that, I quote, no holy scripture can be fairly presented by one who disbelieves its inspiration. I will now consider 8 20th and early 21st century translations. Maulana Muhammad Ali, 1917, Muhammad Duke Pickthall, 1930, Yusuf Ali, 34, Richard Bell, A.J. Arbery, N.J. Dawood, M. Fakhri, and Abdul Halim. Some or all of them are likely to remain in wide use well into our present century, and almost certainly to remain influential and instructive to future translators. The ambivalence of Rodwell and Palmer regarding content and style is gone and is replaced by a sense of awe among the Muslims and of respect among non-Muslim translators. We are now among translators who are intent in their varying ways upon doing justice to the original Arabic, even at the cost of a very large battery of commentary appended to the translation itself, as in the Yusuf Ali version, or published separately as in the Richard Bell version. All the other versions present the text with minimal glossing, intending it as it's, so to speak, intending it to speak as far as possible in its own voice. Now, two ancient problems loom large for all these translators. First of all, is it possible to translate Quranic Arabic into understandable, let alone graceful English? And secondly, what strategy of diction should the modern translator adopt? Earlier translators had struggled with both problems and had expressed varying degrees of hopelessness in the attempt to render the full resonance of the Arabic original. Our 8 translators are in this respect no more hopeful than their predecessors, and Arbery's sentiments are typical. He aims, I quote, to produce something which might be accepted as echoing, however faintly, the sublime rhetoric of the original, a sentiment shared by almost all the other translators in this group. The only dissenting voice is that of Yusuf Ali, for whom the challenge is not so much to carry the Arabic successfully into English, but to make English itself an Islamic language, a far more ambitious endeavor. The second problem, that is the strategy of diction, was more compelling. With the exception of Dawood, Fakhri, and Abdul Halim, our 20th century translators adopted a biblical style derived from the King James or the Revised Standard Versions, leading inevitably to a text overlaid with biblical allusions and parallelisms. The neo-archaic diction is by and large indistinguishable from the diction of Rodwell, Palmer, even Sale. In Arbery, for example, phrases like haply, unto, and verily rub shoulders with thou wouldst, if ye differ, haste unto remembrance, and who forsaketh, etc. It appears that in attempting what Pickthall called a not unworthy language, and Yusuf Ali called an exalted tone, these translators opted to continue with a diction that was fast disappearing even from contemporaneous English Bible translations, to say nothing of the rapid disappearance of Bible study from British schools in the last quarter century or so. This awe of the text, expressed as insistence on biblical diction, results in translations which are frequently too literal and thus incomprehensible, and in a semantic field where the archaic does service for the poetic, or else in free paraphrase. Consider the idiomatic phrase, I think it's on your fly sheet, or what do they call it in Britain? Handout. Consider the idiomatic phrase bima qaddamat aydihim. This is Quran 295 and Passim. The most literal translation would be because of that which their hands have sent ahead. Muhammad Ali translates on account of what their hands have sent on before. Pickthall translates because of that which their own hands have sent before them. Without a gloss, the meaning is at best nebulous. Arbery translates because of that their hands have forwarded, introducing his annoying habit of replacing what with that, and making no more sense than Muhammad Ali or Pickthall. Dawood translates because of that which they have done. And Fakhri follows close behind with because of what they did earlier. Both versions completely ignoring the idiom. Abdul Halim translates because of what they have stored up with their own hands. Yusuf Ali translates on account of the sins which their hands have sent on before them, and he glosses the Arabic idiom as referring to the committing of sins which precede us to the judgment seat of God and he refers the reader to 1 Timothy 24, should be 5:24, for a parallel expression. This single example highlights the manner in which these translators, by and large, dealt with many of the idioms of the Quran. Among them, Yusuf Ali strives to go beyond literalism or free paraphrase, but in doing so, he necessarily reveals his own theological and literary preferences and his belief that a translation of the Quran should be accompanied by a battery of commentaries and short, often lyric, designed to bring the text into line with his own declared taste for English romantic poetry. At the other end of the translation spectrum, Dawood and Fakhri opt for what they call contemporary English, or a simple, readable English, confining the ambiguities of the original to a few footnotes in order to allow the text to speak for itself. This results in pedestrian translations which fail to convey both the concision of the original and its frequent and abrupt changes of mood and tone. In the case of Dawood especially, the translation is not only flat and prosaic, but in its pursuit of contemporary English, goes well beyond the original and often incorporates what should be a gloss into the text itself, resulting in a translation both freewheeling and high-handed. Now I come to something I call the figurative challenge. Tabari had popularized the view that all figures of speech, such as simile, metaphor, allusion, concision, antithesis, alliteration, and so forth, were to be found in the Quran. Later Muslim writers on literary theory would amplify and illustrate. Actually, a body of some 20 or so phrases were singled out by the literary critics as totally original idioms, and these were regarded as part of the more general case that classical Muslim literary scholarship made for the rhetorical or God-ordained inimitability, i'jaz, of the Quran. In assessing the literary quality of Qur'an translations, it may be of some interest to compare modern translations of what the Muslim literary tradition itself regarded as surpassing, indeed divine, figurative expressions. Now, among these 20 or so tropes, two in particular are most often cited by the classical theorists: Quran 19:4 and Quran 17:24. They run respectively as follows: وَاشْتَعَلَ الرَّأْسُ شَيْبًا, and the other one is وَاخْفِضْ لَهُمَا جَنَاحَ الذُّلِّ مِنَ الرَّحْمَةِ. The first phrase, part of the prayer of Zechariah, Luke 1:18, is rendered as follows by our translators. I just run through them very quickly because the handout is in your hands. My head flares with holiness, head shining with gray hair, my head glistened with gray, my head is lit up with white, my head is all aflame, my head is all silver, my head is aflame with gray hairs, my hair is ashen gray. Of these versions, Arbery's, closely followed by Fakhri, reproduces most literally the impact of the metaphor. The Dawood version is the furthest removed and the freest. For the second phrase, which enjoys submission and kindness to parents, we have the following versions: lower to them the wing of humility, lower to them of submission, through mercy, out of kindness, lower to them the wing of humbleness, treat them with humility and tenderness. Again, Dawood completely ignoring it. Lower to them the wing of humility out of mercy, lower your wing in humility towards them in kindness. Here, most versions retain the metaphor of lowering the wing, but Dawood totally ignores it, while Yusuf Ali needlessly changes the word order. Once again, the Arbery version comes closest to the idiom. Now, if one wished to place these 7 prominent 20th century translators in kindred groups, one might argue that Muhammad Ali and Pickthall belong to one group, Dawood, Fakhri, and Abd al-Halim to another, Bell, Yusuf Ali, and Arbery to a third. Suffusing them all, however, is an excessive awe of the original, as if even for non-Muslims, divine speech remains forever beyond the reach of a truly faithful translation. But the Qur'an translators who dressed the Arabic in the robes of King James or of Wordsworth opted for what they thought the most graceful English equivalent, revealing what Matthew Reynolds calls a specially incisive relationship to time. And thus, for a modern reader, emphasizing not so much its foreignness as its archaic hybridity. Should the language of a translation preserve its current identity, or should it allow that language to be powerfully affected by the original so that the result will read precisely as a translation? This is a debate in contemporary translation theory, recently and lucidly arrayed by Susan Sontag, which has, I think, important implications for Qur'an translations. Among translations reviewed here, Dawood, Fakhri, and Abdul Halim attempt what one might describe as current English, but the result is often a continuous prose. All other translators cling manfully to a diction no longer familiar to modern readers. Even Arbery, in some ways still the most sensitive translation, produces on almost every page translations so literal that they become incomprehensible, and where his English is already quite archaic when compared even to the English of his own days. Between these two poles, i.e. preserving the alienness of the text versus bringing out its familiarity, there must be room for a translation which achieves a diction that is at once modern, measured, and worthy of an original, considered untranslatable by many of those who believe in it. I'm eyeing the water with mounting thirst. Now, I come to my last thing, which is called my translation. Thank you. The question to be answered by any new translation must be, does a new translation bring new insight? Otherwise, why do it? It's a fairly widespread sentiment among Arabists and Islamists that no Qur'an translation has attained an iconic or canonical or exemplary status. That there is no King James or Revised Standard Version or even a Jerusalem Bible where the Qur'an is concerned. That all one can say is that X or Y's translation is the least bad among them. There's also a fairly widespread view that the Arbery translation is the most sensitive, graceful, poetical among them. All these are quotations. I have shared and held these views for many years. With the appearance of new translations in the late 1990s, the late 90s onwards, I felt that these newer translations were not in any sense improvements on Arbery, that they held onto a tradition of a prose translation where no account was taken of the frequent changes in mood and register of the original. So about 9 or 10 years ago, I decided to see if I could do something a little different. Why does Arbery need to be improved on? Because, as I argued above, Arbery's language is literal and pretty archaic, bearing absolutely no relationship to the English even of Arbery's own time. So bowing in the direction of Arbery, dissatisfied with prose monotones, I decided to try myself. When I began this translation, there were several issues of various import to be considered. To many ancient and modern readers, the Qur'an progresses through what one might call bursts of revelation. And some classical scholars like Suyuti argued that revelation descended, I quote, according to need, with 5 or 10 verses at a time and more and less. While a more ancient authority, Ikrimah, stated that the Qur'an was revealed in installments, nujuman, of 3, 4, or 5 verses at a time. Now, it seemed to me that any translation of the Qur'an must therefore come to some sort of decision as to where these bursts of revelation begin and end, and reflect this in the arrangement of the text. So it became evident to me that a straightforward tone prose rendering was clearly not an accurate reflection of the Qur'an's structure. By dividing my translation into paragraphs, my hope was to highlight the pericopes upon which the text is built, without, of course, any claim to authority as to the exact boundaries of these pericopes. Now, more complex is the issue of translating the many voices in which the Qur'an speaks to us. For here, the reader will doubtless notice that the register of the Qur'an is in a constant state of shifting. It shifts from narrative to exhortation, from homily to hymn of praise, from strict law to tender mercies, from fear and trembling to invitations to reflection. These, I decided, had to look different. Hence, the horizontal and vertical disposition of my translation. By and large, where the Qur'an is narrating or legislating, I opted for a horizontal prose format. Where it is in any sense of the term dramatic, I arranged in a vertical, poetic order. But here too, I cannot claim to have done anything other than to highlight a translation problem and to offer a tentative solution to it. Equally substantial is the question of glossing the Quranic text. It seemed to me from the very beginning that to gloss the text in any way other than to identify maybe a few proper names here and there is to exercise a false authority, giving the translation a peculiar spin that reflects the translator's own juridical or theological position. The ambiguous, the mysterious, the unfathomable should not be explained away. They should be left exactly as is, in order that readers can make of them what they will. The translator should aim, in my view, at capturing what the text may have meant to its earliest listeners. This, of course, is a tall order, but it is not helped in the least by commentary or glossing. Most pressing of all is the issue of language that one chooses to render Quranic Arabic. Without wishing to engage with the many and fertile theories of translation on offer today, or with the fascinating controversy, it's still raging, over the familiarity versus the alienation of the foreign text, I unconsciously slipped into what I like to think of as measured modern English, whatever that means. At the same time, it appeared to me to be highly desirable to preserve the sentence structure of the Arabic, so long as this did not obscure the sense. In other words, I attempted a balance between the familiar modern and the alienating archaic, but preferring at all times as literal a rendering as possible. In his translation of Beowulf, Seamus Heaney expresses the translator's dilemma as follows. It is one thing to find lexical meanings for the words and to have some feel for how the meter might go, but it is quite another thing to find the tuning fork, it's a lovely expression, the tuning fork that will give you the note and pitch for the overall music of the work. In my search for that tuning fork, I was painfully aware that the cadence of the Arabic could never be truly reproduced, but nevertheless strove for what Heaney calls a directness of utterance in order to convey something of the power of the juxtapositions, rhythmic recurrence, sonority, verbal energy, and rhymed endings of the original. Now, if all this amounts to some kind of answer to the question posed above, about a new translation bringing new understanding, that in itself might be a worthwhile endeavor. Thank you very much.